So let's look at blood vessels on our models. So here would be the heart and the mediastinum, the space between the lungs. And of course that is in the thoracic cavity. Below the diaphragm would be the abdominal and pelvic cavities, or together the abdominal and pelvic cavity. So this would be the right ventricle pumping blood into a blue colored artery known as the pulmonary trunk. And the left ventricle pumps its blood into the red colored aorta. It's not obvious here, but the aorta comes up as the ascending aorta, and then it arches around as the aortic arch, and then it goes behind the heart in the mediastinum as the descending aorta. So I'm going to pull this out, and when I do, we can see the descending aorta going through the diaphragm, and then we pick up the descending aorta in the abdominal cavity. The portion of the descending aorta in the thoracic cavity is known as the thoracic aorta, and the portion of the descending aorta in the abdominal cavity is known as the abdominal aorta. So this would be the superior vena cava coming into the right atrium. The superior vena cava branches into two brachiocephalic veins. And a brachiocephalic vein splits to become an internal jugular vein and a subclavian vein. So this is a brachiocephalic here that splits to become an internal jugular and a subclavian vein on this side as well. Coming off the subclavian and shown only on this side is an external jugular vein. And over here, coming off the brachiocephalic, is a thyroid vein to the thyroid gland. There are three major arteries that come off the aortic arch. The first of which is here, that's the brachiocephalic. And then next to it would be the left common carotid. And then out here, and it's difficult to see unless you're close working with the model, would be the left subclavian. So I'm going to turn this sideways, and this would be the left common carotid, and the left common carotid splits to become an external carotid artery and an internal carotid artery. So I'm going to come down next into the abdominal pelvic cavity. So this would be the descending aorta, which is also called the abdominal aorta in the abdominal cavity. And there's three blood vessels coming off the midline of the abdominal aorta. The first is the celiac trunk, then the superior mesenteric, and finally the inferior mesenteric. There are large arteries off the abdominal aorta that go to the kidneys, and these arteries are known as the renal arteries. There's a pair of arteries off the abdominal aorta that go to the gonads called the gonadal arteries. In males, they would be testicular arteries. In females, they would be ovarian arteries. But the generic name is just gonadal artery. And there's one to each gonad. The descending aorta ends here, where it splits to become two common iliac arteries. And each common iliac artery splits here to become an internal iliac that goes deep and an external iliac more along the surface. With the veins in the abdominopelvic cavity. So this is the inferior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava has an extension they don't show here because it's behind the liver and molded to it. So the liver would be here, and you can see the inferior vena cava here that would go through the diaphragm into the right atrium. If you pull the liver out, you can see the section right here. That's a section of the inferior vena cava, which is behind the liver. there's another vein coming into the inferior vena cava from the liver, and that would be the hepatic vein. Hepatic means liver. We've got the inferior vena cava, and coming off it and running next to the renal arteries would be the renal veins to the kidneys. Over here you can see a suprarenal vein going to this orange colored adrenal gland. The inferior vena cava splits into two common iliac veins, and they too then split to become an internal iliac vein and an external iliac vein. Again, running parallel to the same name arteries. So coming off the inferior vena cava would be the gonadal veins. I do want you to know the blood vessels associated with the heart. So the right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary trunk splits to become pulmonary arteries, one to each lung. The left ventricle pumps its blood into the aorta. The aorta ascends or goes up as the ascending aorta, and then it arches over as the aortic arch, and then it descends behind the heart through the mediastinum, then through the diaphragm and down into the abdominal cavity as the descending aorta. The portion of the descending aorta in the thoracic cavity, what's shown here, would also be called the thoracic aorta. There are three blood vessels coming off the aortic arch: the brachiocephalic, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. The brachiocephalic splits to become the right common carotid and the right subclavian. So this would be the right atrium, and the venous drainage from the systemic circuit comes into the right atrium by way of the superior vena cava, which forms by two brachiocephalics joining together. So into the right atrium would be the superior vena cava, and down here would be the inferior vena cava. The left atrium receives blood from the pulmonary circuit by way of the red-colored pulmonary veins, and this would be a pair of pulmonary veins into the left atrium from the left lung, and then over here would be a pair of pulmonary veins coming in from the right lung. Here are some arteries that I want you to know off the extremities. So here would be an upper extremity, and this artery here in the shoulder region is the axillary artery. And then in the arm it becomes the brachial artery, radial artery that goes down towards the thumb, or artery that goes to the little finger. There's a loop here, and that loop here is the superficial palmar arch. So in the lower extremity, we can see the femoral artery and femoral vein. And then behind the knee are the popliteal artery and the popliteal vein. And then the popliteal artery continues as the posterior tibial artery. And then on the front side would be the anterior tibial artery.